Now I will speak English. First of all, I want to thank Mayor Kim for this very kind invitation, and to Principal Pak and to all of the faculty and students of Hamhyun High School. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here. Thank you.
자, 내가 통역을 해야 되나요? 아니면 여러분들 다 알아들으면 내가 안 해도 되고. 그럼 내가 요약해서 조금씩 할게요. 우선 우리 이제 말씀하신 우리 시장님, 교장 선생님한테 특별히 감사하고 여기 선생님들한테 감사드립니다. 여러분들 만나서 반갑습니다라고 인사를 했어요. 이제 이 닥터 로빈슨 씨는 제가 좀 소개를 더 해드리면 우리 옛날에 아주 어릴 때 한국에서 살았어요. 한 10년 동안. 그래서 한국말을 좀 이해는 해요. 이제 아주 코 흘리게 때. 지금은 이제 세계적인 유명한 학자가 돼가지고 홉킨스 교수로 계시는데, 하여튼 오늘 주로 여러분들 하려고 하는 거는 최근에 매년 재난이 벌어져요, 전 세계에. 이제 얼마 전에 일본서 또 재난이 벌어졌고, 뭐, 쓰나미, 스촨, 하여튼 매년 이런저런 전 세계적으로 큰 이슈가 벌어지는데, 그걸 여러분들한테 소개를 하면서 여러분들이 어떤 이걸 상식적으로 알아두면 좋겠나, 그런 과목을 아마 할 겁니다.
So, while we're waiting, I just want to say that the topic we will talk about today is a very serious one. It can be a very sad one, but my hope is that it will be something that you will learn about, so that whether it happens to you in a disaster or to someone else around the world, you have an awareness of what you can do and have a commitment to try to do something.
오늘 얘기하려고 하는 주제가 아까 내가 얘기한 것처럼 벌써 좋은 주제는 아닙니다. 뭔가 비극이고 또 재난이기 때문에. 그러나 여러분들이 전 세계에서 벌어지는 일들을 좀 이해하고 같이 또 여러분들이 해야 될 일은 뭔지를 알아두는 것들은 국제사회 시민이 될 사람들이 여러분들로서는 중요한 일입니다.
So I'm going to give you some basic introduction to definitions. To causes and types. What are the different types of emergencies and disasters we have in the world today? We'll also talk a little bit about who's who, some of the different organizations and actors who play a role in humanitarian emergencies. And last, not least, we will talk about what you can do as informed citizens of this country and of the world to help respond.
오늘 여기 뭐 다 한국말로 마침 번역을 해놔서 여러분들이 아마 이해가 좀 쉬울 텐데, 오늘 제가 하려고 하는 거는 재난의 정의와 어떤 것들이 재난이 있고 또 원인은 무엇이고, 그 다음에 주로 이 재난과 관련된 사람들은 누구고, 그 다음에 마지막으로 여러분들 학생들이 어떤 일을 앞으로 하면 좋겠는지에 대해서 설명을 하겠습니다.
So, what is a disaster? A disaster happens when we have some kind of disruption, some kind of event that breaks down our social activities. It causes losses of life, it causes destruction of property, and it causes us to no longer be able to cope and to manage our own activities. There are three elements to think about in a disaster. The first, we say, is the event itself. Some kind of event happens, an earthquake, it could be a flood, it could be a war, it could be an industrial accident, or possibly an act of terror. All of these things are events that happen to us. Some are natural, some are made by humans. The next piece of the disaster is the vulnerability, and that's us. That's human beings, and that's how we are acting in an emergency, or how these events act upon us. So we could be older or younger, we could be male or female, we could be rich or poor, educated or less educated. All of these things are part of our vulnerability. And sometimes we have more resistance to a disaster or an event, and sometimes we have less. And it's this combination of event and vulnerability that is what creates impact in a disaster. Should we go one more? So, this is a homework assignment for you. You have to answer right now. I'm going to ask you some questions. Think about this. In California, in the United States, 1971, earthquake 6.8, a serious event. Many houses were damaged. 60 people died. The next year, 1972, Nicaragua in South America, earthquake 5.6 on the Richter scale, so less severe. Less severe. Many buildings were damaged. 5,000 people died. So my question to you is, what's the difference? What was different between California and Nicaragua that would create this kind of difference in mortality?
자, 번역을 좀 해주면 아까 전 슬라이드에서 나온 것처럼 재난이라고 하는 거에 한 서너 가지, 세 가지의 중재 요소가 있는데, 하나는 재난 그 자체, 그게 지진이든 전쟁이든 또는 홍수든 뭐 화산이 폭발하든 쓰나미든 그 사건 그 자체고요. 두 번째는 그로 인해서 사람들이 얼마나 많이 죽거나 다치거나 그것 때문에 고통을 격려하는 거고, 세 번째는 우리가 그거를 적절하게 대응할 만한 수준을 넘었을 때, 그럴 때 어떻게 처리하냐, 어떤 문제가 있냐, 이런 것들을 우리가 이해를 해야 되는데, 이제 그거 관련돼서 이 질문 두 개를 여러분들한테 던집니다. 좋은 대답이 나오면 좋겠는데, 지금 이 질문을 다시 설명을 해주면, 1971년도 한 오래전 일이지만, 미국의 캘리포니아 주에서 6.8, 리터 지진계 6.8이면 굉장히 심한 거예요. 그런 지진이 있었는데, 그때 한 60명이 죽었습니다. 근데 그 다음 해에 남미의 니카라구아라는 나라에서는 5.6이면은 굉장히 적은 겁니다. 6.8보단. 그렇지만 5,000명이 죽었어요. 이런 질문을 여러분들한테 이제 던지고, okay, your question?
So my question is, name 3 things that are different about California and Nicaragua that would explain this difference in mortality. 3 things.
그래서 이 두 가지가, 즉 캘리포니아에서는 지진이 심했는데도 많이 안 죽고, 니카라구아에서는 지진이 그렇게 심하지 않은데도 5,000명이 죽은 거는 한 3가지의 원인이, 뭐가 다른 점이 있다고 생각하는데, 여러분들의 의견은 어떤 건가 한번 답을 주면 좋겠습니다.
You can answer Korean or English.
그래, 한국말도 괜찮아요. 내가 통역해 줄게. 괜찮아요. 그냥 내가 알아들을게. 뭐 하나씩 해도 괜찮아. 세 개 다 해도 괜찮아요. 하나, 2개도 괜찮아요.
Okay, but more developed, what do you mean by more developed?
Maybe in California there is I said there in California there is maybe holiday,
Yeah.
so people are not there.
Okay, let's say that's not the case. So not a holiday, same day. But the next point, next point you said was more developed. And I am asking you, what do you mean by more developed? How? More developed how?
Maybe in California when the earthquake starts, the city were more prepared.
Good. Okay, thank you. That's one. Preparedness. California had alert systems. California had medical teams, police, fire department ready to respond when the earthquake happened. So preparedness, preparation is one. Excellent. Big hand. Okay, number 2. Who else? Volunteer? Yes.
Education for emergency situation.
Very good. People were more prepared. People knew what to do. They heard the alert, they knew what to do. Where to stand in a building, where to go, not to run. This is education, also part of preparedness, but good. That's another good answer. Thank you. Okay? Actually, I'm thinking of 2 more. One more. Think about buildings. Think about the buildings. Yes.
I think the response is better in California.
Okay, that's part of preparedness or response. Good. We've already answered that. I'm thinking about the buildings. Any girls want to answer? I've heard from boys. Come on.
우리 여학생들이 왜 대답이 없냐 그런 질문이에요.
You don't want the boys to beat you, do you?
빌딩 구조 자체가 달라요. 그 뭐지? 캘리포니아는 잘 구조 잘 돼 있어가지고 지진 잘 안 나 있고 지진 잘 안 나고 그러니까 잘 안 흔들리게 해놨고 저거 미카라고 거기서는 그 앞에도 잘 쉽게 무너지고.
Good. So in California, buildings have an earthquake code. Each building has to be built according to safety standards. In Nicaragua, there is either no code or they did not follow the code. So that's correct. One more.
I think that the difference of safety
Capacity?
structure of building.
Okay. Okay, that's similar to the other answer. That's right, but it's similar. I'm thinking of one more part of the explanation. Just one more answer and then we'll move on. Up here? Okay. If there's no volunteers, then I'll tell you. Think about health. Okay? In California, children have immunizations. Children had good diets. Children had proper physical exercise. They had a good health condition. Children and adults. In Nicaragua, more infectious disease, more malnutrition. So when you go into a disaster healthy, you are more likely to survive the disaster itself. When you go into a disaster unhealthy, poor nutrition, poor disease status, you are more likely to seriously be affected, either to die or to suffer injury and long-term consequences.
마지막은 이제 건강과 관련된 차이가 있다는 거예요. 그래서 우선 캘리포니아 사람들은 여러분 다 알다시피 미국 사람들은 영양도 좋고 평소에 예방주사도 잘 맞고 건강하다면 상대적으로 니카라구아 사람들은 예방주사도 많이 안 맞고 또 그러다 보니까 전염병도 많고 그러니까 기본적으로 몸이 약한 사람들이 많아서 재난이 발생했을 때 쉽게 죽을 수 있다라는 거죠.
Okay. When we work on disasters, we try to think about ways that we can organize categories. It's like science. So we think about what kind of disaster are we facing so we can prepare our response according to the type and some of the characteristics. So one way to distinguish is a natural disaster, like a flood or an earthquake, or a human-made disaster, like a war or an industrial accident or an act of terror. We also think about how quickly does this disaster happen to us? How much time do we have to prepare? Sometimes we have only minutes. Maybe we have a few hours. Sometimes we have days or even weeks. So we need to understand how do we think about organizing the types of disasters so that we can prepare ourselves better for each different kind.
여기 있는 것처럼 이제 재난이 어떤 종류가 있냐면 우리가 평소 알고 있는 홍수나 지진이나 화산 폭발이나 이런 쓰나미 같은 자연 재해가 있고요. 그 다음에 이제 우리가 인공적인 사람이 만든 재해가 있어요. 대표적인 게 전쟁 같은 겁니다. 이웃 나라랑 전쟁한다든가 종족 간의 전쟁, 종교 간의 전쟁 또는 종족 간의 갈등 뭐 이런 것들이 다 자연적인 재난입니다. 그걸 우리가 여기서는 이제 non-natural disaster라고 하는데 또는 뭐 man-made disaster라는 표현을 써요. 사람이 만든 재난이라고 이렇게 구분할 수도 있고 그 밑에 이제 보면은 갑작스럽게 생기는 sudden onset, 또 그다음에 천천히 생기는 것. 그 sudden onset은 금방 와요. 뭐 특히 이런 것들이 화산이 폭발하거나 또는 쓰나미처럼 지진이 나는 것들이고 준비할 기간도 없이 그냥 갑자기 닥친 거고 점차 오는 거는 준비할 시간이 좀 있어요. 비가 올 때 비가 며칠 와야 홍수가 나거든요. 그래서 비가 많이 와서 홍수가 나도 사람들이 많이 안 죽는 이유가 준비를 한단 말이죠. 준비를. 그래서 그런 차이가 있다는 거죠.
Okay, I'm going to move quickly past this slide because of time, but let me just say that when the UN and others have studied disasters, the cause that is most associated with suffering, death or injury or disease is poverty. That is to say, poor people, people with less money, resources, education, have more likely risk, higher risk in a disaster. So if we want to address disasters in the world, we need to actually address poverty. And that's why a country like Korea, which is more developed, has less risk during a disaster. It doesn't mean you don't get an earthquake, but when you have an earthquake or a flood, you are more likely to survive with better health. And that's an important lesson. So it's not about just the response during the event. We have to think about how we prepare. And so we think about the effects of disasters, about death, about displacement, people who have to leave their homes for a short period or long period. We think about disease, infectious disease or other conditions, hunger and malnutrition, injury, and of course, psychological trauma. When people experience loss of loved ones or loss of property, displacement from their homes, they feel sad and they can be depressed over a longer period of time. So these are kinds of consequences and causes that we think about to try to address not just in the response, but in the long time afterwards as we get ready for the next disaster.
그러니까 이제 아까 전 슬라이드 보신 것처럼 이런 디자스터, 재난의 가장 근본적인 이유가 하나가 뭐냐면 가난이에요. 가난하면 가난 때문에 재난이 생기는 건 아니지만 그래도 만약 재난이 생겼을 때 좀 여유가 있는 사람이면 그거를 해결할 수가 있어요. 국가도 마찬가지고 또 지방자치단체도 마찬가지고. 그런데 그렇지 못한 데는 홍수가 지던 또는 무슨 지진이 나던 이거를 해결할 능력이 없는 경우에 더 많은 사람이 다치고 힘들어질 수가 있는 거죠. 하여튼 그래서 그런 재난이 오면 여기 쭉 있는 것처럼 사람이 죽거나 또는 피난민이 생기거나 또는 많은 사람이 병에 걸리거나 부상을 입고 또는 기아나 영양실조가 된다라는 얘기죠. 특히 여러분들이 아셔야 될 게 마지막에 있는 심리적 외상, 그래서 사이콜로지컬 트라우마라고 그러는데요. 재난에서 살아남은 사람들이 겪는 굉장히 심각한 질병이에요, 사실은. 왜냐하면 자기가 사랑하는 사람이 죽었거든, 자기 자식이 죽거나 가족이 죽거나 다치거나 했기 때문에 살아남은 사람이 그거를 자기는 살아남았지만 그로 인해서 생기는 여러 가지 정신적 질환에 대해서는 오랫동안 그런 과정이 계속됩니다. 그래서 여러분들이 그것들도 알고 있으면 좋죠.
So when we think about a disaster, we often think about it as having a cycle. The first part of the cycle we think about in preparedness. How do we prepare ourselves if there's a disaster that happens in our community? Do we have a communication plan? Do we have an evacuation plan? Do we have a shelter plan or emergency food or medicine? Then we have the alert, signals, earthquake. We may hear sirens, police sirens. We may hear a loudspeaker announcement, something, maybe just a telephone call from someone saying an event is happening. Then we have the actual event, the impact, the flood, the earthquake, the attack, whatever it is. And then, of course, we try to organize a response. Initially, we think about the military or police or fire department, local communities, Red Cross, all of these different players responding to a disaster impact. Then is a long period where we try to rebuild. We try to restore people to their jobs, to their homes. We try to get food and water and medicine back into a stable environment. This can take a long time, maybe years. And we try to do that so that we don't just return people to what they had, but we try to improve their lives. So we say in the UN and international response, build back better. Not the same, better. So if it's a poor person before the disaster, maybe we can help them learn a job skill, return to a home that is less unsafe, has better building codes or a safer environment. And finally, we want to take these lessons and we want to think about in our city, in our communities, how do we learn from what happened so that we can do a better job next time, reducing risk and improving our capacity to survive.
이 서클 여러분들 보시면 알겠습니다. 이제 재난이 만약에 홍수가 비가 많이 온다. 그러면 우리가 준비를 해야죠. 준비하는 게 preparedness인데. 근데 이제 너무 그게 위험 수위가 넘어서 한강이 넘친다든지 뭐 여기 시흥에는 어떤 강제가 있는지 몰라도 하여튼 한강 이 강이 넘쳐서 사람들이 많이 위험하다 싶을 때는 이제 알러트 경보가 나가고 실제로 그게 넘쳐서 사람들한테 많은 영향을 주고 이제 그럴 때 그다음부터는 대응을 해야 됩니다. 근데 이제 만약에 많은 사람들이 죽거나 또는 집을 잃어버리거나 뭐 지진이 나면 특히 많은 사람들이 이제 다치거나 하는데 그 후에는 재건을 해야 되거든요. 복구를 하고 이게 시간이 많이 걸리는데 하여튼 그런 과정을 거쳐서 또 다시 우리가 잘 배워서 이런 과정을 잘 우리가 이해를 하고 잘 배워서 그 다음부터는 다시는 이런 피해가 안 나도록 하게끔 준비하는 과정이 또 필요합니다.
So here are some pictures that I took and some colleagues of mine. Johns Hopkins was in China after the Sichuan earthquake. I think many of you may have known about this in 2008. Very substantial earthquake, very high level of mortality. So in the first few days, the main job is just to try to dig out, try to rescue people who are injured, take them to safety, find people, maybe recover a dead body or to find someone who is still living, and to make sure as much as we can rescue people from harm. During this time, we will see injuries to the head or the arms. We will also sadly see some people who do not survive. And in this population, we saw many school children who died because their building collapsed on them. This is part of a disaster.
3년 전에 그 중국의 스촨이라고 하는 지역에서 지진이 난 걸 여러분들 아마 알 겁니다. 그때 우리 존스 홉킨스 팀이 가서 찍은 사진들인데 뭐 앞에서 본 사진은 처음 며칠 동안에 응급 구조를 위해서 찍은 사진들이고 이제 특히 저 오른쪽 사진은 그 당시에 그 스촨 대지진 때 학교가 많이 무너졌어요. 예. 그래서 공부하다가 학생들이 이제 학교가 다 무너지는 바람에 천장이 뭐고 다 해서 학생들이 굉장히 많이 몇천 명이 죽었습니다. 그래서 그때 죽은 아이들이 그 장례식인데 그래서 그 당시에 이 학교 건물이 제대로 지어지질 않아가지고 저희 날림 공사를 했던 데가 워낙 많아서 그래서 공부하던 학생들이 굉장히 많이 사망을 했던 그런 사건을 알 수 있습니다.
After the emergency first phase, we begin to try to stabilize. We try to maintain health, and that would mean helping vulnerable people like older adults or young children, pregnant women, people with disabilities, people with illness already. We want to try to make sure they get attention first. So often we will move health clinics and response into areas that are affected. Instead of waiting for people to go other places, we try to take the clinics and help directly to them. After that period, this is when we try to focus on recovery. So people may first move into tents just for a short period of time, we hope, and then gradually they may move into housing that we would call transitional. They're not home, they're not back to their places where they came from, but they're in a place that's more possible to live for a long period. In China, these populations will live in these kinds of homes for maybe 2 or 3 years.
이 사진에 본 것처럼 이제 복구 과정, 재건 과정이라는 게 필요한데요. 그러기 위해서는 특히 지진이 나면 집들이 다 무너지기 때문에 다 집들이 없어지죠. 그래서 우선 급한 대로 텐트 촌에서 사람들이 살다가 빠른 시간 내에 이제 임시 가설 집들을 만듭니다. 저 오른쪽에 있는 것처럼. 그래서 영구히 살 집을 구할 때까지 저런 집에서 한 2, 3년 동안은 살게 될 수도 있습니다.
So now let's look briefly at who has a role in a disaster. And the answer is many people, including you. So we always look to government. In a community, we look to the mayor's office, the city hall, the local police, the local fire department, sometimes the military. We also sometimes can expect help from international organizations, the United Nations or the International Red Cross. Very often, much of the response is done by local or sometimes international NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and there are many in this country and many, many around the world. We also hope that people who are living in those communities will also play a role. They are not just victims, they are not just passive, they are also participants, and we hope that we can use their knowledge, their energy, their commitment to rebuild to play a role in the response. And finally, we are academics. We try to teach about disasters, but we also try to learn the lessons. And we try to document what went right, how do we repeat that, what went wrong, how do we make sure we don't make that mistake again.
자, 이런 재난과 관련돼서 이제 주로 어떤 기관이나 사람들이 참여하냐면 우선 정부입니다. 한국 이게 국가 차원에서 벌어진 일이라면 중앙정부 또 지방정부 차원에서 뭐 예를 들면 시흥에서 이런 일이 벌어지면 시흥시가 참여해야 될 거고요. 그 다음에 국제기구가 이제 유엔이라든지 다양한 국제기구가 참여하고 또 비정부기구 NGO라고 부르는 그런 비정부가 이제 또 이런 문제 개입되고 또 그 피해를 당한 주민들도 이러한 재난에 또 참여해서 복구를 해야 되고 그 다음에 우리 같은 학자들도 역시 이런 문제에 이제 개입을 하게 됩니다.
One place to start if you want to learn about disasters is go to the internet. So I'm sure that all of you know how to go to the internet. You do it every day on your cell phone, on your tablet, on your computer. So this is a place, ReliefWeb, www.reliefweb.int, that has as much information in one place anywhere in the world. So you can learn about disasters right here. You can learn about the floods in Thailand. You can learn about the famine and food shortages in Somalia. Any place in the world, you can learn about the disasters. You can learn about organizations. And you can learn about what you can do to help. There's also many different UN and international organizations. So these are just some of the many that respond to different kinds of disasters. So I don't know if any of you know any of these organizations. Here's the Red Cross. This is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. All of them play a role depending on the type of disaster, depending on whether or not they have an invitation from the government. This is an example of an organization that I have worked with, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they respond wherever there are people crossing international borders who need assistance or protection. This is a group called International Rescue Committee. They work all over the world. They are based in the United States but have programs in many, many different countries. Here is a French organization, Médecins Sans Frontières. They also have an office here in Seoul, and they work internationally. And their work is mostly medicine or health-related programs. And of course, there are also many Korean organizations. Your government makes donations internationally. Your communities have organized to create NGOs, Food for the Hungry, World Vision, Good Neighbors, many more. You have many very strong institutions, universities, who teach and do research in disasters. And there are many others, community organizations, churches, etc., who play a role locally and also some internationally. Should I go on? Okay. Yeah. So here's an example of a website from Korea. This is Korea Food for the Hungry International. So you can go on their website and you can learn about what kinds of projects they do, what kinds of reports they have published, what kinds of activities they are engaged in. You can learn, you can contribute. So here's somebody you should know. Who's this person? Yeah, not this person. This person. Yes, Ban Ki-moon. Who knows who Ban Ki-moon is? That's right. Secretary General of the United Nations. So he leads all of the UN organizations. So he's a very important person for disasters and emergencies. He travels all over the world, meeting with leaders, meeting with his staff, meeting with populations who are affected by war or famine or floods or earthquakes. And he tries to mobilize the UN community and also the donors, people who give money, governments who give money to these responses. So he's a very important person, and you're lucky, we are lucky that he's Korean, and you are lucky that he is a member of this country, but he's also a leader internationally. So I'm going to end with one slide that in many ways I think is the most important slide. Because it's easy for me to talk to you and just say, you should know about this or know about that disaster. It's more important what you do with that information. So if we just sit and talk, that's important. It's part of learning. But the more important part of learning in disasters is to take action. So I will give you a few ideas, and then if we have time, we can talk. Become aware. Read the news. Follow the headlines. Watch TV. Get online. Get informed. So a knowledgeable citizen is the most important base for action in the world. Second, get connected. Follow a disaster story. Link in with an organization that's involved. Follow some organization. Find out what they do. How do they do it? Maybe you can contribute money, or you can write letters of support. Communicate. Write to your government, write to the newspapers, write to organizations, and tell them what you think. And tell them how it's important to you that we respond to disasters. Make a donation. You're just high school students, but maybe even a little contribution. Or maybe you can ask your parents to help to make a contribution to an organization. It can be a Korean organization or an international organization. That's for you to decide. And finally, I would encourage you to volunteer locally. Get to know what your Red Cross is doing, what your city may be organizing in the way of disaster shelters, anything that you can do to respond to human need. Could be poverty, it could be lack of education, it could be people who have illness of different kind. If you get involved, I guarantee the next disaster, your community will be stronger for your action, and the world will be stronger for what you do. Thank you.
마지막 슬라이드만 조금 제가 요약을 해드릴게요. 우선 여기 다 있는 것처럼 이 디제스터, 재난이 IT에서 재난이 벌어지든 일본에서 벌어지든 이게 남의 나라 일이니까 우리가 몰라도 되냐? 그건 아니고, 특히 여러분들처럼 앞으로 국제사회, 국내외의 리더가 될 사람들은 이런 문제가 있을 때 여러분들이 빨리 가능한 한 많은 노력을 기울여서 이런 문제를 알도록 노력하라, 그런 메시지입니다. TV를 통해서 보든가 온라인을 통해서 보든가 다양한 방법으로 이게 어떻게 돌아가고 어떤 과정을 거쳐서 재난 문제가 있는지를 빨리 이해하시라 그런 노력이고, 두 번째는 그 다음에 이해만 하는 게 아니라 실제로 그들과 그쪽 일하는 그게 유엔이든 어디든 그런 기관들하고 계속 또 연결해가지고 계속 여기 보면 Get Connected라고 써 있는데요. 하여튼 관련 기구들하고도 계속 어떤 형태든지 이메일이나 인터넷이나 다양한 방법으로 연결하라는 거고, 그 다음에 이제 격려 편지를, 사실 우리나라에서는 편지를 잘 안 쓰는데 이메일이라도 여러분들이 또는 댓글이라도 달아서 그 동네 그 사람들, 아이들이나 그 사람들한테 격려해주거나 위로의 말을 전해주는 것도 필요하고, 그 다음에 여러분들은 학생이니까 큰 돈은 못 내도 단돈 1,000원이라도 또는 여러 용돈을 아껴서라도 이런 일을 하는 기관에, 그게 어디든 간에 한국 기관이든 미국 기관이든 국제사회 기관이든 약간의 도네이션이라도 이렇게 할 수 있는 정도의 정성이 있었으면 좋겠다. 그 다음에 가장 중요한 거는 이제 볼런티어라는 건데, 여러분들 아마 자원봉사 해본 학생들도 있겠지만 이런 볼런티어를 재난이 벌어진 외국에 가서 볼런티어 하기는 어렵지만 국내에서도 당장 긴급한 재난은 아니라도 여러분들 동네에 어려운 할머니, 고아, 소년소녀 가장 이런 사람들한테도 여러분들이 시간을 할애해서 봉사를 하면서 여러분들의 능력을 배양하면 언젠가는 혹시 우리 지역에 재난이 벌어졌을 때 굉장히 강한, 여러분들 그 강한 리스폰스의 능력을 보여줄 수 있을 거다라는 거죠. Christian?
Do you want to ask? I think we have time for maybe if you have any questions or comments.
자, 이제 이분 강의는 끝났는데 혹시 한 학생의 이런 제목이든 또는 홉킨스에 어떻게 가요라는 제목이든 무슨 질문이든지 질문 있으면 하세요. 이번 기회에 한번 용감하게. 한국말 해도 괜찮아요. 내가 번역해 줄게. 질문 없어요?
질문 없어?
Okay. Then let me say thank you. 대단히 감사합니다. See you again.